Chapter 4, Scene 1. It is natural that he would be a champion of Hutton, having cut his teeth in Edinburgh, said Mr. Prinsep to his dinner companions, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Wyatt. But it is poor form not to allow Cuvier and Werner their proper places, foreign as they are, and may I also note that Comte de Buffon retracted his findings regarding the age of the earth? My word! Our man said he read several passages of the Comte, professing the 75,000 years, as were he immersed in the Bible at noon on Sunday. It appears he has not represented the author at all on the matter. Oh, such sharp practice! Cried Mr. Edwards, as he looked over his new hire. Mr. Prinsep was something of a fading grey dandy, haggard but well shaved, and missing a hand's area of hair his junior self did once possess atop his forehead. More importantly to his company, though, was that he was a natural philosopher and Fellow of the Royal Society of London, the title everything to their wants, and it was neither here nor there that he was a most unproductive member, having contributed no articles to the Philosophical Transactions along his tenure. The three men sat in a private corner of a dining-room of an unpopular coach-house on the north-western outskirts of London, and for the principal's parts, the more private and unpopular these were, the better. Indeed, they were quite content with the heavy rain that presently fell, which discouraged travellers from showing up with desires to occupy their room, and also kept their voices from bleeding ever so clearly through its walls, that the service on the other sides may not gain a thing from their oration. After a mannered slurp of pea soup, Mr. Prinsep continued, "But the spots in the pudding have to do with this 3,000,000-year number supposedly entered into Buffon's manuscript, based on his sediment observations, not because that too was self-removed, as it did not appear in the published edition of Les Époques de la Nature, but because it varies so much from his first number, such that it is the like to an admission that he knows not a true figure. Which is it? 75,000 or 3,000,000 years? If we subtract the latter by the former, we have 2,925,000 years, and if we subtract the former by the age of the earth, then we have 69,176. There is a greater discrepancy between the man's two numbers than there is between his formerly published number and the true age of the earth. Would I had a quill and paper, I could show you that the fractional difference between the division of his lesser and greater numbers and the true age and the greater number is quite insignificant. He could just as well claim the earth to be but 50 years old, and there would be little difference in such and what he has thus put forth." "There!" shouted Mr. Wyatt, slapping his hand to the table. "We have him on that account, but, sir, you mentioned something of Mr. Cuvier and Werner and their proper places." "I did," replied Mr. Prinsep. "You've told me of your parson's account of Hutton, and now I will tell you of two equally compelling philosophical explanations of the origin of our world that vary considerably from the theory of the earth, one by each of these men. First, I must say that Steno's superposition does govern all these men's work, Smith, Cuvier, etc. In this, there is no divergence with the parson's offerings. Indeed, it can be rightly supposed that all these respective philosophers agree that stratification requires some measure of time to be accomplished. But let us examine Werner, who offers that all rock was indeed precipitated or deposited from a receding ocean, originally stocked with all the necessary elements that our strata presently contain. On Werner's earth, we start with an irregular solid body surrounded completely with a primitive ocean that is heavily saturated with these elements or minerals, who over time fall out in series based upon their particular qualities. The primitive series precipitates first, still under water, which contains our primeval rock, granite, granite gneiss and the like. A transition series then follows, universally depositing our most indurated limestone and seemingly intrusive interstices, by Hutton's eye at least. After such comes our stratified series with our fossils and then our sands, gravels and clays, which were deposited on land as the ocean permanently retreated, and lastly, local lava flows. I should add that these lava flows are not the product of some unproven universal underground heat source invented by a sprightly imagination to confound the sweeping of Hutton's erroneous assumptions out the door. Instead, they are the consequence of local coal bed burning, which any man who's warmed his hands by the material can readily understand. I fancy the least burdensome explanation is quite often the most true, that I stand by such dogma fearlessly. Hear him! Mr. Wyatt generously applied to the room. Mr. Prinsep, a glass, he added, emptying the decanter into each of the men's glasses, they all suffering a boiling excitation arising from the discourse. It wasn't that the two staunch Baptists were suddenly great enthusiasts of Werner's hypothesis, but that there existed such articulate opposition to what indeed was flowing out of the Woodbridge parish every other week. To ease in explanation was jollily toasted at such a barking fortissimo that the serving-maid presented some moment later, unprovoked, with a new decanter. After glasses were replenished, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Wyatt then reinvented conversations first had a few decades before, concerning the similarity of Werner's all-encompassing ocean and the Noahic flood, each convincing the other that the hypothesis was evidence for the event and vice versa. Mr. Prinsep then added a secondary piece of evidence by regaling the men of Cuvier's interpretations of what he had found in the geologic column around Paris, a series of strata with alternating sea and freshwater fossils consistently ordered in the rock. Such, he found, was the residuum of multiple singular and catastrophic events, each being followed by periods of stability in which a new succession of flora and fauna would repopulate the land. The last of these catastrophic events, the naturalist explained, was what Cuvier believed to be the founding of Genesis, for the abrupt nature in which each series of fossil did appear over stratigraphic time gave him cause to find no fault with biblical creation. Mr. Prinsep, I believe we understand each other well enough, said Mr. Edwards, when their conversational zeal began to ebb. Please allow me to elaborate more upon the subject I put in my original calling. We have decided that appealing to the town through my person alone would not be efficacious, for it is too coincidental with that of a simple, personal contest between two local men. We thus find it more attractive were a seemingly unattached third party, with some measure of authority, as you have, being of the Royal Society, to intervene in a discreet format, which would allow our town's members to perceive that they were active participants in the countering of Mr. Winter's and Mr. Moore's nonsense. We propose a pamphlet series to be that very format, which may be sold at our local bookstore, that our brethren could read and decide for themselves what is right, true and just, profess it to others among their circles, and perhaps be brave enough to contradict these men's followers when proper circumstances called to do so. Sir, we are asking that you would agree to authoring a series of articles in our piece regarding the follies of these men's ideas. You are not to be harsh against their characters, you understand, just their ideas. We would also dress the pamphlet with news of London and plain agricultural stories, things that may be of interest to those that can read, for the premise of the thing is that it is a London-based operation. You intend to circulate it about London and, say, the lower counties of the island? Asked Mr. Prinsep, silently fantasizing his voice being carried over the country in an extensive manner, and the possibility of some royalty affixed to the sale of his words, were these at all generous Christian men before him. Oh, not at all, sir, Mr. Wyatt returned. We haven't the money for a large scheme such as that. Though it would, as Mr. Edwards has said, be a London-based publication, it is only to be circulated in Woodbridge and Hedgely under the guise that it is delivered to the many Baptist communities about the country. Yet we needn't tarnish other shires or counties with our affairs. Perhaps too, Mr. Prinsep, interjected Mr. Edwards, you may read through this Elements of Agricultural Chemistry and find any divergences between Mr. Winter's intentions and Sir Humphrey Davy's instruction. Several of our lot are happy now that they have let out the lower yielding portions of their land, but we are afraid that some future ruin may occur were Winter's improvements to prove harsh, for the man is not a farmer himself. Chapter 4, Scene 2. Mr. Winter held an old, failing oilskin umbrella against the modest rain that fell outside the plough, as he rehearsed a speech he would shortly be applying to its upstairs meeting-room. Once again, the gross display of beeswax candlelight was blaring out of the windows of the inn, as was the rambunctious noise of the lower caste's drunken revelry from its dining-hall, for it was again Sunday, 1 month removed from his agrarian society debut, and alas, his second meeting was thusly upon him. As he paused in his recitations, he noted the contrast between the quiet, motionless street being sunk in front of him and the rowdiness exuding from behind him. From where he presently stood, he had just moments ago witnessed an overly intoxicated man stumble out the front door and opportunistically pursue a small group of women who had been delivering groceries to the kitchen. "Madam! Oh, madam, so cold am I!" the man had shouted, as the women hastily retreated from the inn. "I'm but a cold piss-pot, unused, unsoiled, neglected. I desire only to be taken out from under the bed, your bed, madam, that I may again receive the bare warmth of—" "Sir," one of the women had returned at a safe distance, "I've not heard the like in such a compelling proposal. Alas, I am already engaged and cannot accept the hand of a man that feeds such an eloquent mouth. I do, however, acknowledge the honour," she wickedly crafted as her companions urged her forward, her lack of reserve briefly reminding him of his young Yorkshire lady. The rain muffled the exchange, but he had nevertheless been motivated to look up the road at the tailor's home, becoming both relieved and disappointed at the lack of stirring occurring in the windows. He'd not seen the tailor's little girl for weeks with the changing of the weather, and hoped her well. The manners on the inside of the inn were no better. He struggled quite profoundly with the folding of his umbrella, and by the time one of Mrs. Bagley's men came to his assistance, he was short of breath and in a slovenly state concerning his hair and posture. Then, at the disposal of his cloak, his now famous blue jacket made its appearance, and that, wrapping such an unkempt person, inspired a set of labourers watching him from the dining hall to offer a few private comments, which were unfortunately inflamed to a roar by their mates. "No, sir, no, sir. The gentleman is not a crapord. He is no so loathsome." "Huzzah!" yelled a chorus of drunkards nebulous to the jester. "Nor sallow-faced, huzzah! Nor hollow-eyed, huzzah! Nor herring-gutted, huzzah! Nor spindle-shanked, goiter-necked, sore-mouthed, sad-looking, half-clad tatterdemalion, petty, swaggering, and nor at all a bog-trotting potentate, huzzah! Huzzah!" The gentleman's dining-room upstairs was of little improvement, for after the white soup, several meat dishes, and a rare Solomon's Temple jelly commissioned for an elderly member's 60th birthday were voraciously put away, the particular faction that occupied the back of the room applied a similar attitude toward Mr. Winter's reported mineral prescriptions that he intended for his sublet plots, as they had their victuals. He had negotiated through the various answers to Mr. Arnold's field a few simpler remedies for his Woodbridge fields, and announced that he would be securing and transporting the marls, gypsums, etc., that were necessary for such undertakings at his expense, having already purchased some of these for his preliminary experiments, this producing none of the ill effect that characterised the cessation of their last meeting. But upon concluding on an unprofitable area alongside the River Compton, east of the Compton Lane Bridge, which had suffered a boggish state during the ungovernable rains of the poverty year, and subsequently a rather stark erosion of its nutrients, and then re-emphasising his idea about profiting from the Society's gathered wisdom, encouraging amiable criticism of his prescriptions, this group, the self-same Baptist dissenters he'd encountered at the last meeting, but with presently a few more allegiant heads among them, called him on this invitation in a rather caustic manner. "Mr. Langley's fields have all to do with the work of the sun and little else, sir. All the like sloped grounds don't see it well and thusly suffer production," Mr. Weston griped in a tone confident he had smoked the trouble as easy as kiss his hand. Indeed, he was ecstatic that Winter had not, being the philosophical flat which he and his brethren now took him for, this notion ringing clearly with the quick lesson that his colleagues' mouths were instantly whetted in hopes that their fellow would deliver more of his superior knowledge down onto the man. "Amen, hear him," cried his lackey, Mr. Smith. "The sun alone does giveth and taketh, like the river's tide and ocean's ebb and flow, and not a mortal to explain it." Having weeks previously dealt with the insecurities of his agrarian partners concerning his designed ameliorations, Mr. Winter felt little visceral excitement from these men's flatulations, yet he did unconsciously raise his voice in reaction to them. "Gentlemen! Gentlemen! Calm yourselves, please. I too did share your thoughts on the want of light on these fields, with added consideration toward the tree line on their southern edge. It is plain there exists a disadvantage. However, I've compared their production against that of the neighbouring fields of the same fate, and others I've discovered who share similar slopes away from the sun. Perhaps it is beginner's zeal, and I do realise the nutrient washings I am considering are heretical and their applications a tough nut to crack, but the proximity of the river for water, the relatively small area of the most impoverished parts of the fields, and their comparable poverty with respect to these other fields do motivate my proposal. Improvement can be attempted with confidence. The explanation did little to calm the gentleman. Indeed, it seemed to rouse his antagonists further, as another stood up and coarsely injected, "The gentleman praises Sir Humphrey Davy's book often enough that we may allow him well versed. Why then does he pay no mind to the professor's follies, or those in the many anecdotes that mark the lectures? Let me provide the room with a taste." On page 283, Davy does state, "Quicklime in its pure state, whether in powder or dissolved in water, is injurious to plants. I have in several instances killed grass by watering it with lime water," whilst on page 289 the man confesses, "I took 4 portions of the same soil. With one I mixed a fraction of its weight with caustic magnesia. Barley was sown into it. In this soil containing this magnesia, it rose very feeble and looked yellow and sickly." On the self-same page he, I venture a little mad, admits to repeating the same procedure with the expected result, finally concluding, as he had previously on page 288, that magnesian lime is poison, the very stuff that you, sir, have offered as one of your remedies to Mr. Arnold. Mr. Winter motioned to object, for Davy's words had been partially disassembled from their context, confounding the perception of the chemist's abilities. Whether the cause was insincerity or ineptitude, he couldn't tell at present, but he did note that the man was reading from a thin, printed parchment and not from the author's official publication, and before he did scarcely breathe in to issue a proper return, he was cut short, the farmer crescendoing his voice preemptively. Continuing on page 295, "Great difference of opinion has prevailed amongst agriculturalists with respect to the uses of gypsum. In America it is employed with signal success, but in most counties of England it has failed, though tried in various ways, and upon different crops. Page 301 and 2, gentlemen, my word. The man does contemplate manuring the ground with salt." At some length this man, a Mr. John Chandler, continued, having fully usurped Mr. Winter's oration. Most of the room, whom were looking downward to avoid eye contact with Mr. Winter when the man had first begun, eventually twisted their heads or bodies toward the back to watch this unexpected defiance. He spoke and read well for a country Baptist farmer, and seemed to possess something of a philosophical attitude, were it not that he relied so heavily on his paper, with which he firmly squeezed in his hands, as though it were an opponent. And what can be said of an anecdote where a manure was applied and a good crop produced, other than that the manure was not injurious? For could it be that it was not the work of the compound, but that of natural conditions, rain and sun, which were just that much more amiable during the season, with comparison to the last? Then there is the problem of how a manure relates to a local soil for a given region of our island. It is all well that a ferruginous water used on a meadow in Priestley Bog near Woburn did no harm to its grass. Yet, all that may be gathered from such is that conditions there and there alone were cordial to the compound. His allies provided ayes and nays at appropriate moments, and their frothy rambunctiousness increased in virulence until one Anglican farmer began to object on the grounds that Mr. Chandler was arguing against oversimplifications, catalysing several other Woodbridge members to loudly throw their opinions into the room. Remarks were loudly grumbled that though they were little used around their towns, it was well established that other parts of the island and America limed and marled with reliable result, and that criticism of Davy did not make it any less so. Mr. Winter, realising he would never get a word in without also breaking propriety and tossing his rebuttals in amidst the building cacophony of the others, did so. One must understand the book in its entirety, as well as Sir John Sinclair's, and other suitable material published by the Board of Agriculture, sir, he fired off. It does no right to quibble with half-plucked bits of the lectures. Further, restoration of deficiencies ascertained as such by the quantified examination of surrounding soils, supported by further botanical experiment, is indeed the plum of the pudding. Yet his arguments did not reach the opposite side of the room, or at least were not acknowledged if they did. Its players were so entirely immersed in producing repetitious adverts, results do not imply cause, and what is well in Leicestershire is not so in Hedgely, that they cared not to hear reason contradictory or adjudicative to such. The rabble crested past what had occurred during the last society meeting, striking Mr. Winter in its likeness to that of sitting in his office in Smethwick, as his father's machines filled the building with reliably pulsing noise. It was only when George Moore overheard a Baptist member start to argue against James Hutton's decay of solid bodies by their exposure to the atmosphere and their resolution to fine particles that washed into the ocean, claiming such happened very little if at all, and not by some means of constancy as he does insist, and that not all rivers meet the ocean at any rate, that he tapped his rabbit-headed walking stick to a front-row table to retrieve order to the room. He declared several of the back of the room drunk, though they were not, with not a man in the room believing they were. Mr. Winter was asked to reassure the members that he only sought to mimic the rich constituents of their local soils in places that were a bit lacking, and anyone not interested may thusly join their labourers below. Chapter 4, Scene 3. Mr. Winter watched from his bedroom window as the smoke from his glass-house chimney wafted upward, its gentle twists interrupted by obtuse gusts of wind, that the trail leapt about, yet never did consider stark disconnection. From this he turned his eye to the mug of hot coffee on his desk, that too enjoyed a dreamy flux of particulates ascending into nothingness, their only mark, the burnt and earthly flavour saturating the southern half of the room. He put pen to paper. I am a great marauder of farmland, whose prime desire is to cover its fields completely with iron and glass, that I may take part in the tax money incurred by such extravagance, my father, of course, adjudicating the deal, and with the secondary benefit that it confuses its labourers, that not a ploughman may plough, a tiller may till, a roller may roll, or a wife may gavel the corn. At least this is how I am thought of in Lower Hedgely, its constituents having been unilaterally poisoned by such a supposition. This, among other absurdities, discovered at last Sunday's society meeting, seemingly producing a social return inside this set, as each player reinforced the notion to the group. Sir Humphrey Davy too was misrepresented by these men in like manner, and I deflated at the occurrence, having been under the impression that not a one of them cared a damn about chemical philosophy. Perhaps none do, for they seemed more concerned about damaging half-truths than formulating proper concerns regarding the materials in his lectures. Fortunately, their impropriety was not countenanced by other members who had paid some mind to my personal explanations during our previous engagements, and after a few dire moments we were able to discuss communally these individual recommendations I did make during such calls. I am happy to offer that these were well received, and that through the experience of the members, plans on how to apply the labour involved with the greatest economy were settled. By cart or canal the quarry's bounty shall come, and quite an interesting season shall we have in 21. However, one young gentleman did call earlier this morning, whose field but needed a simple liming, confessing that as he was no expert here or there, when it came to such manuring, he had it in mind to quit our agreement, and had begged me to take my coins with a pence interest. I told him I would keep his money for him, and if success were to be had by next autumn in the other 9 fields I've commissioned, then I will again ask to sublet his plot with the self-same moneys plus a year's interest, and if none were to be had, we would be square and friendly. I did at the conclusion of the society meeting invite any man that possessed an agreement with me to dinner at a time of their choosing, that they may afterward read through the particular passages in my library which were relevant to their case, were they to find comfort in doing so. But this man was shy as a function of his age, thus I did not press the matter after restating my invitation and his declination at the time of his appearance. What's this? The laughter of one of our kitchen gals, I believe, upon passing a companion in the upper hallway. There are moments, such as those afterward this young gentleman, or after having been licked credibly by these Baptists, that a man is in incredible want of a woman, that the mind may resolve onto something good, simple and pure, and be delivered from the melancholy derived from social complexity. He put down his pen. His mind wafted, and a gust blew it onto Harriet Moore. 7 times he'd properly been in her company, having sat with her at all 3 of her father's scientific lectures thus far, and having accompanied her and Charlotte to the bookstore on those Sundays after church, when the lectures were not held. 7 times, and in that duration only fleeting moments with his Yorkshire lass. She was not afraid to show her teeth. She did make him forget, just for a small folding of time, the weary episodes that buzzed about him which his attention was obliged to converge upon, transiently. The possibility of failure concerning his soil experiments, the arrogant blather of the Baptist farmers, or that he would some day inherit his father's operations and cheerlessly become one of mankind's few masters and tyrants. Would she could soften him through that terminality, that final stretch of walking path, then he could admit some greater comfort in the world, and perhaps some trebled intent if time would allow. Once again his pen did fall. Northerner and northern beauty, a great proficient of the slight divergence from what may be thought proper of a woman in a manner all too agreeable to a bachelor. She sees too much, hears too much, thinks too much, yet lets it show little, that it is tolerable to her family and peers, but such is always there to be had by the astute observer, the astute lover. She has me whipping and hallooing my mind along on occasion, laughing at anecdotes that are not inherently amusing, for her presentation makes them so, and believing in irrational purpose. Beloving. I would not expect such beauty to last. It shall be bought directly by a handsome fortune and face who'd settle locally for such a prize, and were he at all a dullard, as fair chance would allow, never realise the full value of his purchase. The part she does play for the sake of others would solidify, and nothing else would be expected of her, past my hastily written words. Goodness, simpleness, and purity. For my part, time is the limiting nutrient. How many proposals must I suffer before my work in Woodbridge and Hedgely is accomplished, and I am accepted as more than a coach-house resident, that I stand a proper chance of making my own? My fate is intimately woven to the sprouts who have just this day shown in my boxes. Let them in my mixed soils grow luxuriant, and January's caustic incorporations be rendered fertile, for I have dosed them light on account of the want of time to react properly. Chapter 4, Scene 4. Mr. George Moore, sitting in his dining hall with his immediate kin, Charlotte and his wife Isabel, chewing silently for some moments, noticed the servants had temporarily vacated. "Charlotte," he lightly directed at his daughter, "you've been here and back to the bookstore several times with Mr. Winter and your cousin. I have a question that may be out of character for reasons that I may not disclose presently, but you must trust it has some merit beyond base curiosity. Here I will ask, is it possible at all that your cousin does fancy Mr. Winter?" "Oh, Papa, you surprise me as had you asked if at all I do." "Do you?" "Papa, I'm sure I'm not confident either way, for 100 things run through my cousin's head from one month's end to another. Sprightly she is with ideas and concerns of the world, that she is harder to read than every book, lecture and pamphlet she has conquered thus far. Certainly she finds his aptitude for invention and related discussion answerable, but it is only natural to be delighted in new things, new and interesting members of the towns, that is to say. You and Mother must forgive me for this, and her too, but a woman of her mind may find a rare man interesting without desiring to be bound to him and bear his children." "That's a yes, then." "Oh dear, Papa," cried Charlotte. She, sailing dangerously close to the spinster's horizon, did not like to be teased on matters of love and marriage, even on her cousin's behalf. By his rumoured income and proximity to Woodbridge alone, Charlotte would have no hesitation in accepting a proposal by the man, and by the manner in which certain aspects of her cousin's character burned more luminously in his presence, there was a significant chance that Harriet was of the self-same mind. She calmed herself, and supped daintily her tea to garner contemplation on how to reply to such bombardment. "It is of little consequence, Papa," she returned. for he did once mention to the both of us that he thought rather highly a local woman from another Yorkshire family, if you can imagine. I cannot. Do you know of any, sir? Mr. and Mrs. Moore turned towards one another, silently interrogating each other's countenances, but the effort was fruitless, more so when their daughter added that she thought the family to be a clerical one. The squire, not easily accepting of defeat, especially at his daughter's expense, did then attempt a speculative offering. Well, I suppose Reverend Hatcher from North Leach may be from the north, and one of his daughters might indeed be of the marrying age. It matters little, dear, injected Mrs. Moore, intent on alleviating her husband's miserable guesswork. For if the man did let such be known to Charlotte and Harriet, then he was but politely informing them that they should not expect him to deliver pursuit upon one or the other. He is a good and kind gentleman. Thank you, Mrs. Moore. Yes, that is something to clasp hold of, said Mr. Moore, who shook his head in affirmation, then returned to the silent chewing of his lamb, as if the entire matter had not been brought about just then. The Moore ladies, inwardly, were not so easily cured of the topic. Were there no other explanations for Mr. Winter's words to the girls that could be roused out from another gentleman's perspective? Certainly, just as Harriet could find interest in a man without her loving him, Mr. Winter too could think rather highly of a woman and have no romantic notion towards her, or so their afterthoughts went. He had said no more about her than what he'd said the day they first walked from church to Hedgely. Very little, suspiciously little. It was not that he was entirely reserved, for he spoke at length on the workings of engines, or the making and moulding of iron, or the like. Yet he did talk most sparsely regarding elements of a personal nature. He rarely referenced his parents, and when he did, it had only to do with his father, and generally the man's business. Such very well could, however, be secondary to a deficiency on the girls' parts. They, meaning Harriet, were so wrapped up in youthful philosophizing with this observer of the world that they never had thought to ask him about siblings or where he did spend his youth, etc. And who indeed was this mysterious woman that none of the table could own, even with their credible knowledge of all things social, nebulous to the towns? Perhaps as she was unknown, she was therefore penniless. Or perhaps she was an apparition, conjured up to spare the Moore girls, as it was possible Mr. Winter had no interest in either one. How easily such a fine prospect could slip away, thought Charlotte, with a few quickly drawn words and a slowly made attention toward them. Chapter 4, Scene 5. After dinner, the great observer of the world himself did call, and he and Mr. Moore sat in front of the fireplace in the squire's office, sampling a few small glasses of cider brandy and port, stoking the topic of last Sunday's society meeting. They are high-spirited on occasion, Mr. Winter, but I've never seen the like for a great while, not at least since the year 16. Such a rabid orgy of howling, hunting spaniels, exclaimed the squire. Yes, sir, all tearing at themselves over an empty bush, returned Mr. Winter, so that his position would be clearly understood. Oh, I am reminded, the old gentleman cried, as he leapt up and made way toward one of the handsome shelves behind his desk. Mr. Winter, during the interim, put back his port and stared into the fire, trying mildly to find the faces of the spaniels in it, as it cackled and popped defiantly. Here we are, sir. Here's what all the fuss was about, said Mr. Moore, carrying what looked to be an exact copy of the well-spoken Baptist's propellant, a thin 8-page news pamphlet entitled The Balanced Scale, which suffered a poorly shaped imprint of an apothecary scale below its heading. There was some discussion of this piece at the bookstore during my niece's last excursion. The owner was a bit impenetrable as to how it came to be at the store, other than to say it happened to carry some local news and that it did newly serve the Baptists as the Anglican does us. Mr. Winter opened the piece and leapt from one story to the next, noticing several of the article headings exuded a certain inflammatory quality. The second and third pages' material came with an introduction entitled Parson near Baptist Hedgely Issues Sermons of Science, Destroys Faith, which had to do with Mr. Moore's lecture series, followed by antithetic flavoured arguments regarding the man's subject matter, Atheist Hutton's Earth Theory, thoroughly passed by Werner, Cuvier, Kirwan and the Bible, and the age of the earth. Numerous fools ply foolish numbers, an attack on Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, William Smith, and Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. The perpetual retractionist Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, read Mr. Winter aloud, topped it the knob, debauching Newton, whose own calculations coincide favourably with the dear Archbishop Usher's, by his neck-or-nothing attempt at applying the great man's celestial mechanics to blasphemous explanations of the birth and age of the earth. So went the man's rationale, that a great comet, 1/650th the mass of the sun, did imperfectly collide with the object, causing a set of debris that coalesced into our planets and moons, these pieces inheriting the extreme temperature of the sun and then cooling over a period of time. Leclerc thus rationalized that he could discover the age of the earth by examining the cooling times of molten earthly materials with respect to their sizes, thusly applying those times proportionally to the size of the earth. By this method he came to the number 75,000 years, which again he retracted, having been smitten by a higher authority to do so. Yet had such intervention not occurred, its appeal still would have directly faded. For some years after, it was discovered that comets were not nearly as dense as what was believed in Leclerc's time, thus exploding his entire rationale and method. "Well, they do make a fine point with regard to the comet density," remarked Mr. Winter. "But to dismiss Leclerc's method of calculation in collateral fashion is fallacious. The supposition that the earth was a brilliant fireball at some point in the past is not absolutely dependent upon such being derived from a comet's collision with another celestial body." "You too do not go unnoticed, Mr. Winter, if you hadn't already smoked it, by the treatment dispensed upon you during the meeting," observed Mr. Moore. Yes, I see. The author does the same to Sir Davy as he does to the scientific practitioners championed by Mr. Moore. Confusion seems to be his trade, more than philosophical interpretation. He preys upon his audience's ignorance, for this is certainly not meant for dedicated practitioners, more like to simple Christian men. What motivates a Londoner to affix himself to the matters of a country village in such manner I do not gather at present, though it certainly has had a deleterious effect thus far. I've had one man quit his agreement with me, said he did not want to look a flat in front of his neighbours, reliant he was upon them for guidance on account of his age, and am now down to 9 fields for the next season, but such is still quite an interval away, and I would regret any more of the same on account of this. Mr. Winter folded the object rather loudly and handed it back to his owner, adding, "And I trust it has not vexed Mr. Jonathan Moore, for I am anxious to hear of the effects of deep time on species this coming Sunday." "Oh no, not at all," Mr. Moore assured him. "I believe he's quite busy with his preparations and hasn't had time to pay it much matter. But what o'clock is it?" he cried as he spied a carriage roll past his window in the distance, coming toward the house. "I haven't an idea, sir. I wear no watch." "Mr. Winter, you must forgive me, for I have a man that has come on account of one of our daughters. Would God let him take the both of them," said the squire enthusiastically, having jumped from his seat to look out his window. "You may have noticed, sir, that they are quite handsome, no doubt a sign of our superiority and confirmation of our rightness of place in this world. There is a consensus about the towns I've noted that does support it," returned Mr. Winter, he too joining Mr. Moore at the window to view the rather lavish carriage and four, which was in preparation for its owner's alightment onto the front driveway. "Mr. Winter, would you at all mind accompanying Charlotte for a few moments in perhaps one of the drawing-rooms? She does sing clever enough for you to ask. Or even a stroll up to our garden if you do not mind the cold, having walked here, of course, to take a look at a peculiar chimneyed wall I am installing, that I may espalier a few pear trees. I would imagine you'd find the contraption of interest." Mr. Winter did indeed find the contraption of interest, as he puzzled out the snaking path of the flue in the half-built structure, wondering if such a thing would be amenable to a boiler and pipe system. However, it didn't take long to expend the thoughts born from its examination, and he looked around to see what else might be worthy of inspection. Over the open park in front of the property, Winter did spy an unidentified raptor circling the area, which on occasion swooped downward out of his sight, no doubt harassing a set of pigeons, a rabbit, or the like. He made way toward the area where, at a distance, he found the bird perched in a leafless sycamore, yet not a moment afterward it responded to the whistle and arm gesture of Mr. Moore's hawker, flying down to meet the man, the tinkle of its bell barely audible. He raised his arm in recognition of the man, and the man did the same. An agreement was thusly made that Mr. Winter should observe the team's operation. He then applied himself onto an ornamental bench that sat alongside the driveway leading to the stable and carriage house to do so. "Wish me well, brother, for I am soon engaged." A man's happy voice did materialise, startling Mr. Winter, for some time had quietly passed between his sitting down and the man's apparent approach. He stood up hastily, causing a hypertensive daze, and for a period he did not hear or see the man, only to find him directly in front of him when his senses were restored. "I'm so sorry, sir," he said to the stranger, as he shrugged off the last of his confusion. "Would you please repeat your name?" The young man was certainly a gentleman by his dress, and was most likely the owner of the carriage that had earlier arrived. "Wyatt, sir, Mr. Wyatt. Are you at all well?" "I believe I've unjustly surprised you in my excitement," replied the young fellow, shaking a little from not the autumn cold. Yes, I believe I've but stood up too fast, having kept my mind long on the bird in the distance," said Mr. Winter, motioning at the hawk and introducing himself. "Oh, Mr. Winter, yes, for my soon-to-be betrothed has mentioned you often," cried Mr. Wyatt in a designed tone of delight. "I've heard you are a credible natural and material philosopher. Here, let me shake your hand, sir." "Well, congratulations, Mr. Wyatt," he returned as the man savaged his hand. "But I must report that you have me at a disadvantage. Charlotte has but briefly mentioned you in passing. I had no notion she did. That is to say—" "Charlotte, sir?" Mr. Wyatt genuinely asked. "Charlotte Moore is not your aspiration?" "Heavens, no, ha-ha! Though surely she could be an agreeable second. Yet I do see how the lady would be your most rational deduction, as I am here in front of you at Woodbridge Manor, rather than at the parson's door." Mr. Winter's heart, previously slow to awaken as he had quit the bench, now accelerated profoundly and beat so adamantly that had he not again lost his wits, he would have observed it in the back of his throat as his jaw dangled loosely. The parson's door, indeed. He was quite certain Mr. Wyatt had owned the very words. "You see, sir," explained Mr. Wyatt, "just as George Moore cannot command the hawk directly and must appeal to the falconer, I too suffer the like. I'm but a country Baptist, and have no gifts of falconry. I also must sway the falconer, the self-same squire, to therefore have the bird submit to my limited position, for without the bird I cannot catch the prey." Mr. Winter's face capitulated to a blast of cold October air. "Harriet Moore,"